Hello everyone and welcome back to Navis Nobilite. I am Captain Zelnick and today I am going to be talking to you all about squadroning in this tutorial video. We're going to go into a deep dive into the rules for it, talk about a couple of rules that are not currently in the official rulebook remastered yet that you really should know, and try to demystify a lot of the rules involved with them because they can surprise you for how good and sometimes how awful they are for your fleet. So let's get into the details. First things first, when it comes to escorts and an escort squadron, they always function off of a single leadership roll at the beginning of the game when you roll your leaderships. If you are rolling for a squadron of cruisers or capital ships in that regard, they each have their own leadership. The highest one is the one you work off of. That means if a leadership value in the squadron, highest one, suffers, say, a bridge smashed or is hit by the sepulcher of a Necron tomb ship, and loses the highest leadership, it will go down to the highest leadership in the other vessel. One way or another, you always function off of the highest leadership value in a capital ship squadron, and escorts always function off of the group leadership that is rolled for them. You cannot have capital ships escorted in the same squadron as escorts, and you cannot have capital ships, cruisers specifically, light cruisers and cruisers, cannot be squadron with grand cruisers, and they cannot be squadron with anything but grand cruisers, and battleships can only be squadron with battleships. That particular rule was omitted from this write-up and will be added later. So if you have a squadron of grand cruisers with a couple of other cruisers, you can't do that. I'm sorry, guys. Now, what are the benefits and the negatives of squadroning your ships? Number one, your command checks, all of them, including special orders, are done off the highest leadership. That also means, however, that the entire squadron goes on the same special order. So, if you have a squadron of cruisers and you want to lock on, you roll once, the whole squadron goes on lock on. The other thing is that the benefits of the special orders, the effects, are all the same. So if you go on all ahead full, all ships go the same distance. So you only roll once overall. Now the downside is if you all ships go on the same special order, that means if one ship braces for impact, all of them brace for impact. So you must bear that in mind. Okay? Because that could really screw things up if one ship is about to be shot to death, but the rest of your fleet is fine, you may be losing out on an ideal firing solution. So bear that in mind. Now, squadron compositions. Capital ship squadrons must be deployed and declared as such before the start of the game, which means before the game one rolls, before deployment, you must determine which ships are in what squadrons. Escort squadrons are selected as squadrons. It is very, very rare to have an escort all by itself. And they can typically, unless specifically said otherwise, can contain up to 6 ships. Okay? No more, so it's generally 2 through 6. The ships in a squadron can be different classes, as long as they are of all the same type. So you can have a squadron of 3 Cobra and 3 Firestorms. In practice, it's generally a good idea to form squadrons from the ships of the same class because it makes maneuvering and choosing special orders easier, but it's a matter of taste. Now, this means you can have any kind of light or standard cruiser. So those two are fine. Like I said before, in a squadron, you can have any escort from your fleet in a squadron. You can only have grand cruisers with grand cruisers, and you can only have battleships with battleships. So bear that in mind. Now, formation on the board. There is what is called a squad coherency if you're an old school 40K player. All escorts must be within 15 centimeters. If for some reason you move out of 15 centimeters, you must spend your move actions to get back within 15. If you're not able to, you do not have any action. Okay? Sometimes it'll drop out of formation due to bad maneuvering, if a ship has been destroyed, etc. If a ship drops out of formation, it is no longer counts as part of the squadron until it moves back to within 15 centimeters of another ship in the squadron. A ship which is out of formation must be moved back into formation as soon as possible, and it may not use special orders the squadron uses until it has done so. Okay? So bear that in mind when you are moving. It's generally a good idea to make sure your ships move, roughly speaking, in the same direction. Now, individual ships within the squadron can maneuver freely in the standard movement rules so long as they stay in that formation. If any ship of an escort squadron moves off the table edge, the entire squadron and in subsequent turns only must attempt to disengage. So even if one decides to bail out by accident, the rest follow. So stay away from the table edges if you can, okay? Now, this is where things get a little weird. Shooting at the squadrons. When a squadron is targeted, it is quite likely that some of the vessels will be present at different targets aspects to the attacker. Some of the ships may be closing and others a beam. In this case, the attacker can select which category of targets to go after, but he cannot score hits on anything harder to target in that category. So if I'm shooting at the closing ones, I cannot cause damage to the abeam ones. Plain and simple. So, example, a ship has 2 ships closing and 2 abeam, and if he attacks at them as if they were all closing, he can only score ships on the closing ships. So, but if you attack everything on a beam, you can hit everything. So bear that in mind. The only way to shoot at a more distant member of a squadron is with gunnery weapons if the ship has more left modifiers on the gunnery table, or has a weaker armor where only the hits that could not hurt the closest target if hit. So because the weaker armor ignoring weapons cannot exploit this. So lances cannot apply to this. So this demystified. If you are targeting 2 ships and one of them, specifically with guns, okay, has a armor value that you're shooting at that is weaker than the other ship in the squadron. So if a ship is a beam and has a 5 up side and the other one is closing and has a 6 up front, you can target the 5 up side. You'll get fewer shots, but you'll hit more often. All right? Even if the other one is closer. Okay? Or it has more left modifiers on the gunnery table. And that, of course, means it is easier to shoot. So this is one of those situations that people don't realize. This is a violation of the target priority rules. Okay? So bear that in mind. Allocating hits against squadrons. When a squadron is fired upon, any hits scored are allocated to the nearest eligible ship in the squadron until it is destroyed. Which means if you are shooting at a squadron from multiple points, it will always go to the nearest vessel to where it is being shot at, which means it doesn't just go down the line even if it doesn't make any sense. So you have to be aware of the direction of fire. It isn't like 40K where, well, this guy already has a wound, even if the other guy on the other side is the one most likely to take the hit. Nope, the guy on the opposite side of the squad dies. There's no, tracking bullets in Battlefleet Gothic. So if you are attacking a squadron and your goal is to cause as much damage as you can, generally speaking, it is better to fire upon them from one direction, because that means all of the damage goes in a sequential order from one side to the other. So bear that in mind. This only applies to shooting and does not apply to ordnance attacks, which are specific. So if I hit you with an assault boat on the nearest vessel, but a vessel behind it already has shields down, doesn't matter. It hits that specific vessel. It's not like 40K. A leadership test cannot be taken to pick out individual ships within a squadron. This does not apply to ordnance attacks. So again, this is effectively a way to violate the rules of target priority. If you don't want a ship to be targeted by an enemy, just move another ship in the way. It'll actually allow you to use ships in a squadron to soak up fire. And that is a really good way to use things like light cruisers to defend your bigger ships. Hits taken by a squadron are only distributed among the vessels that actually took fire, such as in range and fire arc, regardless of how many hits the squadron actually took, which means even if you stack up 50 hits on one guy because he's in the arc and range but everyone isn't, it doesn't ripple through. Okay, again, this is not 40k. Regardless how many hits the squadron actually took, though it affects all escorts within range and fire arc. This also applies to hits taken by an escort squadron negotiating an asteroid field, which means if one ship goes to the asteroid field, it doesn't knock out other asteroids to hit your friends as they fly around it. Now, this also is hits delivered by Nova Cannon. So you can only cause damage to things under the template. So, again, it is only fire and damage only apply to the things you can hit. So, moving on, different armor values. A mix of squadron ships may include vessels with different armor values, or armor may vary because the ships have differing values on their fronts and sides. When attacking a squadron with a mix of armor values, find out what the lowest armor is before rolling the dice. Any dice with equal to or beat the lowest armor value in the squadron will score a hit. Okay, allocate the dice one at a time, starting with the lowest against the nearest targets that they can affect and work your way up. So, what does this mean? It means that if you are firing into a squadron, say you have a strike cruiser, a Space Marine strike cruiser, and you have a normal Imperial cruiser. So let's say you have a Dauntless in the same squadron as one another. Any hit of a 5, okay, will damage the Dauntless, and any roll of a 6 could potentially damage the strike cruiser as well. All hits count. So in this example, the Unclean is firing on a mixed squadron, including a Sword class frigate and a Cobra. Rolling 3 dice, he scores a 4, 5, and a 6. The 4 is good enough to hit the Cobra and is allocated to it. The 5 and 6 can hit the Sword, and both are allocated to that ship. So what it means is, if you had that case that I just gave you, the Dauntless and the Strike Cruiser, any roll of a 6 goes to the Strike Cruiser. Any roll of a 5, even if it's further away, goes to the Dauntless, which could mean it's a good way to differentiate damage and dilute damage across the squadron, but it doesn't mean necessarily that you can easily defend people. Yeah, unfortunately, actually, if you think about it, now that I think about it, you can defend people from a pretty significant amount of damage if you have a strike cruiser along with ships that don't have that armor 6, if that makes any sense. Because say you have a normal Imperial cruiser and it's squadron with a strike cruiser, any roll of a 6 will go to the strike cruiser and not to the main cruiser, which means the damage will be diluted across the board. That can be very handy. Now, if you're in a mixed squadron of escorts, okay, that's particularly bad, because it means that you're going to cause more damage to weaker escorts. And any higher damage will take out your more valuable escorts. So it's better for cruisers, not quite as good for escorts. Okay, capital ship squadrons. Capital ships and squadrons that are fired upon to the point that one of the capital ships is destroyed must roll for and apply all critical damage before counting as destroyed. The easiest way to avoid confusion is to roll each d6 critical roll separately while recording the damage. So just be sure that you apply your critical hits appropriately. This rule in particular applies to squadrons of ships that do not count critical damage normally and insist take an additional 1 HP of damage, like Orc, Rux, or Kroot War Spheres. If a capital ship squadron disengages in its entirety, each capital ship calculates its percentage destroyed for victory points separately, not as the whole squadron, and not in the same manner as escorts. Shooting squadrons. Squadrons combine their firepower. Shooting by squadrons. All squadrons combine their fire together, as if it was one giant salvo. Escort squadrons have their total firepower added up and halved, rounding up, when on special orders that affects weapon strength. Capital ships have their fire and strength halved individually, rounding up, not in toto. Even if in a squadron, escort squadrons do not have their weapon strength halved solely because the squadron is crippled. That is really, really cool. So bear that in mind. when a squadron shoots, it is subject to the normal rules and restrictions for a single ship. So all ships must have the appropriate arc, and it must pass the leadership test fire other than its closest enemy. So bear that in mind when you're firing at a target. Everyone has to have arc, everyone has to have range, and they pass the leadership test together to do so, not individually. Squadrons firing weapons batteries normally add their fired power together before working out how many dice to roll on the gunnery chart. However, squadrons firing weapon batteries can throw up a few problems because ships may not be in position to fire at the target ship from different aspects and ranges. Where this occurs, calculate the ship's firepower individually. Which, again, not a problem. Just bear that in mind and pay attention to what you're doing. When calculating the ship's firepower individually, this only applies to ships firing at different firing arcs. To clarify the example, if a squadron of 5 sword frigates are firing on a cruiser where 2 are in the rear arc and 3 are in its beam arc, the 2 escorts behind it would calculate their firepower as moving away, and 3 on the ship's beam would calculate their firepower moving together as a beam. Then take these two sums, add it together, and make your dice roll. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. Now, launching ordnance. This is one of the important elements of ships in squadrons because ordnance is combined. If you are base-to-base together, any ships in base-to-base contact with other ships can opt to combine their ordnance together into a bigger attack craft wave or torpedo salvo. When launching a combined salvo of a squadron, the salvo must all be in the appropriate firing arc and its furthermost edge at the limit of its speed from the furthest stem ship. So you basically measure from the furthest ship back, okay? And they must be in base-to-base contact, all right? Now, some ships can't for any reason combine their salvos in this manner. And you'd measure from the distance, as seen here in this fun little image here, you measure from the furthest ship back, okay? And that's the basics of squadroning. It is a very, very useful little ability in Battlefleet Gothic to combine certain ships together that really amplify the capacity to cause a huge amount of damage. Especially escort squadrons, definitely cruisers, and I've even seen a couple of grand cruisers be squadroned together for really lethal effect. Battleships, I've only seen it rarely. I think I've only seen battleships squadron together once. And when it was used, it was certainly lethal, but it was also a giant target for incoming enemy fire. So it didn't work out, I think, as the other player really wanted it to do. I think it's really good on paper. I don't think it's really good in practice. But let's talk about some ships that would do really well in a squadron. And I'm going to start with the good old Imperial Navy. What a great place to start. Okay, and right here, the Lunar class cruiser. The bread and butter cruiser of the Imperial Navy is probably the best idea for squadroning. Why? Because it squadrons with all of the other baseline cruisers of the Imperial Navy and provides incredible benefits. Now let's have a look at the reason why. Now I went over this in the Lunar class cruiser video. And I'm going to go over a little bit here again, mostly focusing on its firepower, because the individual firepower of a Lunar is pretty subpar when you're talking about its guns. It has a great torpedo salvo, which is really what makes the Lunar really, really good. But all of these other weapons here, the lances, the batteries, they're pretty weak. They're not really anything to to phone home about. If you're lucky alone, it may cause like 1 point of damage, maybe 2 if you're really lucky and in a really good position. But what if you have 2 Lunars base to base with one another? Well, that makes these lances go up to a strength 4 on both sides and these batteries to a strength 12 on both sides. What a great combo. That's a much more lethal salvo, and by bringing these 2 ships together, it makes them more defensible, makes them harder to kill. It also makes their torpedoes way more lethal. You're threatening battleships with that amount of torpedoes. And if you want, you can even replace the torpedoes with a Nova Cannon, though Nova Cannons really don't benefit from squadroning, but everything else does. And a squadron of 2 Lunars honestly has functioned for me way more effectively than any other way to use the lunar. But there are a couple of other ships that are really, really good with squadroning, even with a lunar. The Gothic, another great example. It has a great broadside for lances, but no weapons batteries. Well, why not give it a lunar? Give it a lunar buddy. Boom, suddenly it has some weapons batteries, and now it has 6 lances to fire out each side. What a great combo. Very, very dangerous for anything that is an Eldar. Well, okay, well, maybe you want even more. Okay? You can do it with the Tyrant, though I would recommend actually that the Tyrant should fly by itself with other Tyrants just because of the differing rules on its range. But over here we have the Dominator. If you're playing the old Blue Book list, the Dominator works great with Gothics and Lunars. You get a Strength 12 weapons battery, and you get a Strength 4 or 2 lance, and you can up this if you want to 18. It becomes way more lethal at close range. And there's that beautiful Nova Cannon. There's nothing wrong with Nova Cannons. Everyone loves Nova Cannons. So just bring a lunar with a Nova Cannon, or take 2 Dominators. Why not? It's all a matter of your points and your preference. But squadroning works very well for Imperial baseline cruisers. It also works very, very well for dictators, their carriers, because all of this stuff works great together. Why not launch your bombers and fighters in squads of 8 as opposed to just 4? Why not launch Strength 12 weapons torpedo salvos, all functioning off of the same reload order? What a great thing to do. It's how I play with my dictators. I always squadron them together because inevitably one of them is going to have a better leadership than the other, and I want to reload reliably off of a single damn roll. So, dictators, great for squadroning. But we can move up into the battle cruiser area. Overlords, best battle cruiser to squadron together of the entire Imperial Navy. Why? These beautiful 60-centimeter weapons. Individually, by itself, it's pretty weak at only strength 8 at 60. Together, it's strength 16 with 4 lances at 60 centimeters. This thing has, for a reasonably comparable number of points, better firepower than the Retribution battleship and has a better torpedo salvo on top of it. So, yeah, I highly recommend it. And, of course, you're going to want to take the targeting option right here to get a left column shift on the gunnery table. The double overlord is always a good choice if you're playing in a fleet that lets you take them. But let's move up into the Armageddon, another great ship to combine together. Why? It's basically a super lunar. An Armageddon with another Armageddon is powerful enough to start breaking apart battleships with very little issue. The better range on its weapon batteries means a threat to Eldar vessels, and 2 of them makes them even more lethal. These things are consummate ship killers. Always a good idea. Now, I'm going to skip over the Jovian and the Mercury and the Dominion because, again, my point is proven. They do very well together. But moving into the Grand Cruisers, a couple of the fleets give you just enough wiggle room to take more than one. Look at this. Strength 16 weapons battery. Just look at that. Multiply that by 2. How is that not a good thing? Come on. It's also a big, sturdy, difficult to kill ship. And we just go into all of these other ones. Exorcist. This thing can take Shark assault boats. The weapons batteries can be upgraded to strength 10. Why not take 2? The Vengeance. Why not take 2? Why not double up that beautiful firepower? Why not? Go ahead and do it. And as we said, up here in the battleships, it doesn't really work that well. But maybe we should go to, instead, some Chaos ships. Why not have a look at the Murder, if I can actually get down there? Going all the way down to Chaos. Forgive the slow progression here, everybody. And sorry for the screen flicker. I'm sure it's painful for some people. All right. All the way down, we have the Chaos list. Now, Chaos vessels are not necessarily as beneficial to squadroning as the Imperial Navy are. Many of their vessels are designed far better to function by themselves. So, the Murder class cruiser is a different story. As you can see, its firepower by Chaos standards is pretty average, only at a strength 10, port and starboard and 45, and 2 lances out the prow. It's only 170 points. You're probably going to be taking more than one. Why not squadron them? Suddenly you have strength 20 weapons batteries, port and starboard, and 4 lances at the prow. What a great little drill in space. I always squadron my murders. And the Hades heavy cruiser, which is basically just a murder with a pair of dorsal lances at 60 centimeters, combine a murder with 2 murders and a Hades. Congratulations. Anything you're moving towards is going to die, and anything that tries to get on your side is going to die with you. So, what a great ship. The Slaughter, oh, that's a Carnage. Carnage is a good choice, but it has enough firepower to function on its own with no problems. The Slaughter also, it has enough firepower to function on its own. It doesn't need to be squadroned. But if we go up here, the Devastation. Now, the Devastation has a pretty mediocre weapons loadout, but it is a carrier. Well, what if you combine 2 Devastations together? Well, suddenly that's far more powerful. That's a strength 4 lance battery, port and starboard, at 60 centimeters. That's really good fire support for your close-range ships. It lets you launch a squadron of 8 instead of a squadron of 4, and the prow weapons battery right here goes up to 12 for close-range combat. What a great thing. Now, if you decide to do this, which is what I do with my Devastations, there's one heavy cruiser that actually begins to shine. And that's everyone's least favorite heavy cruiser, unless you're a weirdo like me, the Acheron. The Acheron is actually far closer to a Devastation than it is any other ship in the Chaos Fleet, because it has the same Strength 2 lances on the left and right at 60. And it has a prow weapons battery at 45. But it also has, instead of launch base, it has 2 dorsal lances at 45 as well. Combine these in a formation, not a squadron, but a formation of Devastations, and you have these super long range lances that stay away from the main line of the enemy fleet, dropping between 8 and 4 and 8 lances if you take 2 Acherons, which I do. And it is astoundingly effective at shooting down enemy cruisers from a very long range. The Hades, in order to bring its big firepower to bear, has to be facing towards the enemy. This sucker can remain a beam, which means it's harder to hit with returning weapons battery fire. So, if you like your Devastations and you take them in a squadron, take some Acherons as well. Put them in a squadron, have them fly alongside your Devastations, and drop these 60-centimeter lances from an extreme range and punch your enemy out from across the battlefield. I highly recommend these in a squadron. Now, if we're going to move into I already talked about the Hades. The Styx does not need squadroning. Executioner, another Grand Cruiser. Let's just make more lances together. Let's just be happy and have, a strength 12 lance with you and me together. Getting these things into a single fleet is a pain, but hey, maybe you play really big games. But yeah, do it. Do it. Strength 12 lance, left and right. Just do it. Have fun. The Vengeance. We already talked about this in the Imperial section. The Repulsive. This ship only really functions well by itself. If you manage to get 2, you can squadron them to get really disgusting firepower, but it really does just as well on its own. But it is still good to use in a squadron. Nothing wrong with that. Retaliator. The only reason why I suggest against the Retaliator being in a squadron of 2 is that it's a very expensive ship, and I prefer to take a bunch of upgrades on this thing to make it just the most disgusting corn boarding action delivery system that I can. But it has all of the same benefits that the other Grand Cruisers have if you want to take it in a squadron of 2. You can also take it in a squadron with a Retaliator and Executioner, and you'll have a lot of synergy with your lance ranges. So if anyone gets close, you can really cause some damage between those 2 ships. And then again, we move on to the battleships, and Chaos battleships really are meant to fly alone. Now, you can look through all of the other fleets in the game, and you can look at their weaponry, and you can go, that's kind of weak. But what if I had 2 of them? Suddenly it's not weak. So there's a lot of benefits to going through all of your lists and looking at ships that you normally would never take. And then you realize, oh, I meant to take 2 of them and have them fight side by side. That's really one element of the game that a lot of people miss out on. So, remember, Light cruisers and cruisers can squadron together. That means you can use a light cruiser as a meat shield for your bigger ships. All right? 2. Grand cruisers can only be squadroned with grand cruisers. Battleships can only be squadroned with battleships. All right? You get all of the benefits and all of the negatives. And if somebody starts shooting at a squadron, the pain doesn't stop until all of the dice are rolled, which means damage will ripple onto other ships. So, read the rules on Squadrons very carefully. All right, everybody, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all again in the next video.